London, 1820. Between scandal and redemption, there is only one step, or, in my case, an extended hand. I, Genevieve Ashworth, never imagined that my wedding day would become London's greatest public humiliation, that 300 people would witness my fiancé abandoning me at the altar, that a marquess, the man I had secretly admired for years, would intervene before I crumbled before the crowd. But what I truly didn't know is that shame can be the beginning of freedom. This is the story of a woman who was left behind but refused to stay down, and of a marriage born from scandal that transformed into the truest love. But before we dive into this story that defied all the conventions of Regency society, tell me, from what corner of the world are you watching? Leave your comment, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because this journey promises to be unforgettable. Truth is always more fascinating than fiction. There are moments in life that define us, moments that cleave our existence into a clear before and after, as decisively as a sword through silk. For me, that moment arrived on a June morning in 1820, dressed in white satin and Belgian lace, standing before the altar of St. George's Church in Hanover Square. I should have been radiant. I should have been trembling with anticipation for my future as Lady Pemberton. Instead, I stood frozen, feeling the weight of 300 pairs of eyes boring into my back as the minutes stretched into an eternity of humiliation. Let me be clear about something from the start. I harbored no romantic illusions about my marriage to Lord Pemberton. Charles Thornton, Viscount Pemberton, was a practical solution to a devastating problem. My father, once a respected gentleman with a comfortable fortune, had managed to gamble and invest our family into near-complete ruin over the course of 3 painful years. The townhouse in Bloomsbury was mortgaged. The country estate had been sold. My mother's jewelry, all except her wedding ring, had been quietly auctioned off to pay the most pressing creditors. When Lord Pemberton proposed, it wasn't on bended knee in a moonlit garden. It was in my father's study, over brandy and ledgers, with me standing awkwardly to the side like a piece of property being appraised. He would receive what remained of my mother's dowry, carefully protected in a trust that my father couldn't touch. In exchange, he would settle our most urgent debts and provide my younger sister with a modest dowry of her own. I was 23 years old, firmly on the shelf by society's cruel standards, and I accepted because I believed I had no choice. My sister Catherine deserved better than poverty and ruin. My mother deserved to hold her head up in church, and I had long ago resigned myself to the fact that love was a luxury for women with better fortunes than mine. But standing at that altar, I began to wonder if even that cold comfort would be denied me. 15 minutes past the appointed hour, the Reverend shifted uncomfortably, his prayer book trembling slightly in his hands. He kept glancing toward the church doors with an expression that oscillated between hope and dread. My father, standing stiffly at my side, had gone pale beneath his cravat. I could hear his breathing, shallow and rapid, could sense the panic radiating from him like heat from a furnace. The congregation began to whisper. At first, it was the subtle rustle of fabric and the barely audible murmur of speculation. But as 30 minutes became 40, the whispers grew into undisguised conversation. I caught fragments of it, each word a small knife in my pride. Perhaps he's been delayed. 40 minutes. It's hardly a delay. The Ashworth finances, you know. Perhaps he's reconsidered. That last comment, delivered in a carrying voice by Lady Hutchinson, a woman who had never forgiven my mother for being prettier than her in their youth, nearly broke me. My hands, clutching a bouquet of white roses that had begun to wilt in the warmth of my grip, started to tremble. Pride. That's what kept me standing when everything in me screamed to gather my skirts and run. Not pride in my situation. God knows there was nothing to be proud of in that moment, but rather a stubborn, burning pride that refused to give these people, these vultures dressed in silk and jewels, the complete satisfaction of watching me crumble. I lifted my chin. I kept my eyes fixed on the altar, and I silently recited every mathematical equation I had ever learned, every line of poetry, anything to keep my mind occupied and away from the yawning chasm of despair that threatened to swallow me whole. 45 minutes. An hour. The whispers had evolved into open laughter, quickly stifled behind fans and gloved hands, but laughter nonetheless. I heard my father make a small broken sound beside me. The Reverend cleared his throat and leaned toward me, his expression a mixture of pity and professional discomfort. clearly preparing to suggest we abandon this farce. And then I saw him, Alexander Blackwood, the Marquess of Ashford, entering through the main doors of the church with a stride that commanded every eye in the building. He was impossibly tall, dark-haired, with features that could have been carved by a master sculptor, all sharp angles and aristocratic elegance. His coat was perfectly tailored, his cravat an example of mathematical precision, and his eyes, those dark, inscrutable eyes that I had admired from afar during countless balls and social gatherings, were fixed directly on me. My heart, which had been beating a panicked rhythm against my ribs, simply stopped. I had harbored a secret, shameful admiration for the Marquess of Ashford since my first season, 6 years prior. It was the sort of hopeless infatuation that young women with no fortune and less prospects allow themselves in the privacy of their own thoughts. He was so far above my social station that we had never exchanged more than the briefest pleasantries. At crowded balls, I would position myself where I might catch a glimpse of him. I memorized the sound of his rare laugh, the way he moved with such confident grace, the kindness he showed to those beneath his station, a quality rare among men of his rank. But I had never dared to hope for anything beyond those stolen glances. The Marquess of Ashford could have any woman in England. Why would he ever look at Genevieve Ashworth, with her dwindling fortune and increasingly desperate circumstances? Yet here he was, walking down the aisle of St. George's Church, with the entire congregation watching in stunned silence. The whispers had died completely. Even Lady Hutchinson appeared too shocked to speak. He stopped directly before me, and for a moment, time itself seemed to suspend. His dark eyes searched mine, and I saw something in them that I couldn't quite decipher. Determination, certainly, but also something softer. Concern, perhaps? Or was I imagining that, projecting my desperate hopes onto a man who likely viewed me as nothing more than an unfortunate victim of circumstance? Then he did something that changed everything. He extended his hand toward me, gloved in perfect white kidskin, and spoke. His voice was steady, clear enough for every person in that church to hear, and it carried the weight of absolute authority. He told everyone, that if I would accept, he would stand in place of the absent bridegroom, that if I agreed, he would make me his marchioness, not out of pity, but because he believed I deserved better than the humiliation I was currently enduring. The church erupted. Gasps, exclamations, and the sound of several women's fans snapping shut in shock created a cacophony that seemed to come from very far away. I heard my father's sharp intake of breath. I saw the Reverend's eyes widen to an almost comical degree, but all I could focus on was Alexander Blackwood's steady gaze and his outstretched hand. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind in that suspended moment. This was madness. This was scandal compounded upon scandal. This was a gesture born from, what? Impulse? Some rivalry with Lord Pemberton I knew nothing about? Genuine concern for my welfare? Or merely the whim of a powerful man who was accustomed to bending the world to his will? But beneath all those rational questions, one emotion burned brighter than all the others. Fury. I was furious at Charles Thornton for his cowardice, furious at my father for putting me in this position, furious at this entire glittering, judgmental society that had gathered to witness what they thought would be my complete destruction. And I was determined, absolutely determined, not to give them the satisfaction of seeing me destroyed. So I placed my trembling hand in Alexander Blackwood's steady one. His fingers closed around mine with surprising gentleness, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature of the church. He turned to the Reverend, who still looked as though he might faint from the shock of it all, and calmly confirmed that he wished to proceed with the ceremony. With me. Immediately. The Reverend stammered something about proper licenses and bans, but Alexander produced a special license from his coat, as though he had anticipated this exact scenario, which seemed impossible, but was nevertheless occurring. The sight of that document, official and legal, and already bearing his signature, made my head spin. Everything that followed happened in a blur. The Reverend, overwhelmed by the presence of one of England's most powerful peers, began the ceremony again. My father, torn between relief at our family's salvation and shock at the sudden turn of events, managed to give his stammered consent when asked. And I spoke my vows in a voice that shook only slightly, all while acutely aware of Alexander's hand holding mine, strong and sure. When the Reverend pronounced us married, Alexander lifted my hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to my gloved knuckles. It was a gesture of perfect propriety, witnessed by 300 people, and yet it sent a shock of sensation up my arm that left me breathless. We processed down the aisle together, and I kept my chin high, my eyes forward, refusing to look at the faces that had so recently been laughing at my humiliation. Let them stare. Let them gossip. I was no longer poor, pitiful Genevieve Ashworth, abandoned at the altar. I was the Marquess of Ashford, and they could choke on their envy. The carriage ride to Ashford House in Mayfair was conducted in silence. Alexander sat across from me, his expression unreadable, while I struggled to process what had just occurred. I had entered that church expecting to become Lady Pemberton, trapped in a loveless but necessary marriage. Instead, I was now married to the man I had admired from afar for 6 years, under circumstances so scandalous that London would be talking about it for years to come. Finally, as the carriage rolled through the streets of fashionable London, I found my voice. I thanked him, because gratitude seemed the only appropriate response to such an extraordinary act. But I also needed to ask him, why? Why would he do such a thing? Why would he tie himself to me, a woman with no fortune, no powerful connections, nothing to offer a man of his standing? He was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying me with an intensity that made me feel as though he could see straight through to my soul. Then he told me that he would explain everything in time, but for now, I should rest and recover from the ordeal, that we would have time to discuss the particulars of our arrangement, and that I need not fear for my family's welfare. He would honor the agreements made with Lord Pemberton and more. It was a practical, measured response. And yet, something in the way he looked at me, something in the careful way he avoided directly answering my question, made me wonder if there was more to this story than simple nobility, or even practical concern. As the carriage pulled up to Ashford House, a magnificent Georgian mansion that dwarfed anything I had ever called home, Alexander descended first and offered his hand to help me down. His touch, even through our gloves, seemed to burn. He welcomed me to my new home, his voice formal, but not unkind. And as I stood before that imposing doorway, still in my wedding dress, the same dress I had put on expecting one life and now wore having been thrust into an entirely different one, I made myself a promise. I would not be weak. I would not be pitied. I would not waste this extraordinary second chance, however it had come about, by collapsing into tears or uncertainty. If Alexander Blackwood had given me a title and a position, I would prove myself worthy of both, and perhaps, in time, I would discover the truth behind those dark, inscrutable eyes. But first, I had to survive my first day as the Marchioness of Ashford. Ashford House was not merely a residence. It was a statement of power, wealth, and centuries of aristocratic privilege. As I crossed the threshold that first afternoon, still wearing my wedding dress like some sort of bewildered ghost, I was struck by the sheer magnitude of what my life had become in the span of a single, catastrophic morning. The entrance hall alone could have contained the entire ground floor of my family's townhouse in Bloomsbury. Black and white marble tiles stretched before me in a dizzying checkerboard pattern. A grand staircase curved upward with the grace of a swan's neck, its banister polished to such a shine that I could see my reflection in it, pale, wide-eyed, and utterly out of place. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings so high they seemed to touch the sky itself, and portraits of stern-faced Blackwood ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes following my progress with what I could only interpret as disapproval. A small army of servants had assembled in 2 perfect lines to greet their new mistress. The butler, an imposing man with silver hair and the bearing of a military general, introduced himself as Morrison. He had been with the family for 37 years, he informed me with professional pride, and would be honored to assist me in any way I required. The housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, was a stout woman with kind eyes and capable hands, who bobbed a curtsy that seemed almost affectionate despite our having just met. They were all watching me, judging me, wondering what sort of mistress I would be, this nobody who had been elevated to their ranks through the most scandalous circumstances imaginable. I could see the questions in their carefully neutral expressions. Would I be kind or cruel, competent or helpless, worthy of their loyalty, or merely a temporary embarrassment to the Ashford name? Alexander stood beside me during these introductions, his presence a solid anchor in a sea of uncertainty. He explained to the assembled staff that I had endured a difficult morning, and should be shown every courtesy. His tone was commanding, but not harsh, and I noticed how the servants responded to him, not with fear, but with genuine respect. It spoke volumes about the kind of master he was, and I filed that observation away with all the other small pieces of information I was gathering about this man who was now my husband. After the introductions, Alexander guided me upstairs to what would be my private chambers. The Marchioness's suite, he called it, as though that title belonged to me, and not to some elegant stranger who knew how to navigate the treacherous waters of high society with grace and confidence. The rooms were breathtaking. A sitting room decorated in shades of cream and gold, with French windows that overlooked the private gardens. A dressing room larger than my childhood bedroom, with wardrobes that stood empty and waiting. And finally, the bedchamber itself, dominated by a 4-poster bed draped in silk the color of champagne, with morning light streaming through windows dressed in gossamer curtains. Alexander paused at the doorway between my suite and what I assumed must be his own chambers, the master's suite, separated from mine by a connecting door that he made no move to open. He told me that I should rest, that a maid would be sent to help me change, and that we would dine together that evening to discuss our arrangement. The word hung in the air between us, loaded with implications I wasn't quite ready to examine. Then he did something unexpected. He asked if I was all right. Not in the perfunctory way one might inquire after an acquaintance's health, but with genuine concern that softened his aristocratic features and made him seem, for just a moment, like a real person, rather than an untouchable marquess. I assured him I was fine, which was a magnificent lie. I was many things in that moment, overwhelmed, confused, grateful, terrified, but fine was not among them. Still, I had my pride, and I would not collapse into hysterics before this man who had already witnessed my public humiliation. He seemed to see through my facade, but he didn't press. Instead, he simply nodded, told me that Morrison could fetch him if I needed anything at all, and withdrew to his own chambers with a final, unreadable glance in my direction. The moment the door clicked shut, I allowed myself to breathe. A maid appeared shortly after, a young woman named Sarah, with soft brown eyes and gentle hands who helped me out of my wedding dress with admirable discretion. She didn't ask questions, didn't make conversation beyond what was necessary, and I was grateful for her tact. The dress, that beautiful prison of white satin and lace, was carefully hung away. I wondered if I would ever look at it again, or if it would simply gather dust in some wardrobe. A ghost of the day everything changed. Sarah helped me into a simple day dress, one of my own garments that had been hastily brought over from my family's house, along with my other meager belongings. The contrast between the elegant richness of my surroundings and the worn fabric of my own clothing was painfully obvious. Sarah, bless her, pretended not to notice. Once alone, I did what any sensible woman would do in such circumstances. I explored. My suite was a revelation. The sitting room contained a writing desk, stocked with creamy stationery embossed with the Ashford crest, a small bookshelf filled with novels and poetry, and a comfortable chaise positioned perfectly to catch the afternoon light. Someone, Alexander presumably, had thought about what a wife might need or want in her private space. The consideration touched me in a way I hadn't expected. The dressing room's empty wardrobes seemed to mock my limited wardrobe, but I refused to feel sorry for myself. I had been poor before this morning. I would simply be poor in more luxurious surroundings for now. Alexander had married me to save me from humiliation, not to provide me with a new wardrobe. I would manage with what I had and be grateful for it, but it was in the bedchamber that I paused longest. That enormous bed, that symbol of matrimonial expectations, seemed to dominate the space. Alexander and I were legally married now. We had spoken vows before God and 300 witnesses. And yet, what exactly did he expect from this union? What were the terms of our arrangement? The thought of that connecting door between our chambers made my heart race in a way that was equal parts anxiety and something else I didn't want to name. I had admired Alexander Blackwood from afar for 6 years, had memorized the sound of his laugh and the way he moved through a ballroom with effortless grace. But admiring someone from a distance and being married to them were two entirely different things. I forced myself to stop staring at that door and move to the windows instead. The gardens below were magnificent, carefully manicured lawns, rose bushes just beginning to bloom, and walking paths that curved between flowering trees. It was beautiful, peaceful, and utterly foreign to everything I had known. The afternoon passed in a strange blur of unpacking my few belongings, familiarizing myself with my new rooms, and trying desperately not to think about the dinner conversation that awaited me. Sarah returned periodically to check if I needed anything, and I began to sense that she had been specifically assigned to look after me. She was efficient and kind, and I made a mental note to treat her well. Good servants were worth their weight in gold, and I suspected I would need all the allies I could get in this household. As evening approached, Sarah helped me dress for dinner in my best gown, a simple creation in pale blue that had been fashionable 3 years ago, but was now hopelessly out of style. Again, she said nothing about its obvious age, and I appreciated her discretion more than I could say. Morrison appeared at precisely 7 o'clock to escort me to the dining room. The walk through Ashford House's corridors was an education in itself. Priceless artwork adorned the walls. Marble busts of Roman emperors stood in alcoves. Every surface gleamed with the kind of cleanliness that required an army of servants to maintain. This was wealth beyond anything I had ever experienced, and it was now inexplicably mine to command. The dining room could have seated 30 people comfortably. Instead, it seated 2, Alexander at the head of the long mahogany table, and myself at his right hand. The arrangement was more intimate than I had expected, and I wondered if this was his doing, or simply how married couples dined in houses like this. He stood when I entered, a gesture of courtesy that seemed almost absurd given the circumstances of our marriage, but which I appreciated nonetheless. He had changed from his wedding clothes into evening attire, and if possible, he looked even more imposing than he had in church. The candlelight cast shadows across his sharp features, making him seem almost severe until he gestured to my chair, and something like a smile touched his lips. We observed the formalities as the first course was served, a delicate consommé that I could barely taste through my nervousness. Alexander made polite conversation about the weather, the gardens, whether I found my room satisfactory. I responded in kind, both of us dancing around the enormous elephant in the room. Why had he married me? It wasn't until the second course had been cleared, and we were left briefly alone between services that Alexander finally addressed it. He set down his wine glass with deliberate care and looked at me directly, those dark eyes holding mine with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. He told me that he owed me an explanation, that he understood how confusing and overwhelming this day must have been for me, and that he wanted to be clear about the nature of our arrangement, so that there would be no misunderstandings between us. My heart was pounding so hard I was certain he could hear it. Alexander explained that our marriage was legal and binding, but that he had no expectations of me beyond what I was comfortable providing. He would not force himself into my chambers, would not demand the traditional rights of a husband, unless and until I indicated I was willing. We would present a united front to society, would attend functions together as required, but in private, I was free to live my life as I chose within the bounds of propriety. It was a generous offer, more than generous, and yet something in me recoiled at the coldness of it. He spoke as though we were business partners, not man and wife, as though he had rescued me from one loveless arrangement, only to install me in another, albeit more comfortable one. I asked him, point blank, why he had done it. Why had he married me? We barely knew each other. He could have any woman in England. Why tie himself to me, with my lack of fortune and my scandalous circumstances? For a long moment, he was silent, and I watched emotions flicker across his usually controlled features. Consideration, hesitation, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Then he told me something that both answered, and raised more questions. He said that he had his reasons that were complex, and which he was not yet ready to fully explain. But he assured me that he did not act out of pity, that he believed I deserved better than what Lord Pemberton had offered, that he saw in me qualities he admired, resilience, intelligence, grace under pressure, and that he thought we could build something worthwhile together if I was willing. It was carefully worded, revealing just enough to intrigue while concealing what I most wanted to know. Did he feel anything for me? Or was this truly just an arrangement of convenience? A marriage of mutual benefit where I received financial security and social position while he received, what? A wife he didn't particularly want, but felt obligated to rescue? I thanked him for his honesty, even though it wasn't quite as honest as I wished it to be. And I told him that I would do my best to be a credit to his name, to fulfill my duties as Lady Ashford, and to not cause him embarrassment or regret. Something flashed in his eyes at that, perhaps surprised that I was already thinking of my responsibilities rather than dwelling on my own confusion. He told me that he had no doubt I would excel in my new role, and that if I needed anything at all, guidance, assistance, or simply someone to answer my endless questions about the household, I had only to ask. The rest of dinner passed more comfortably after that. Alexander proved to be an engaging conversationalist when he set aside his formal reserve. He told me about the house's history, about his responsibilities as Marquess, about the various properties and estates that fell under his stewardship. He asked about my interests, my education, what I enjoyed reading, and slowly, carefully, we began to sketch the outline of a relationship that was neither romantic partnership nor purely business arrangement, but something cautiously in between. When dinner concluded and Alexander escorted me back to my chambers, he paused at my door. He wished me a good night, and reminded me again that I need only ring for Morrison if I required anything. Then he hesitated, as though he wanted to say something more, but thought better of it. I thanked him one final time for everything he had done, and he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. He told me that I need not keep thanking him, that we were married now and would face whatever came together. Then he bowed, actually bowed, as though I were a duchess and not a woman he had rescued from public humiliation that very morning, and withdrew to his own chambers. I stood in my sitting room for a long time after he left, staring at that connecting door and wondering what exactly lay on the other side. Not physically. I knew that was his bedchamber, his private domain. But emotionally? What thoughts ran through Alexander Blackwood's mind when he looked at me? What had truly motivated his extraordinary action this morning? As I prepared for bed with Sarah's assistance, and finally climbed between the silken sheets of that enormous bed, one thought dominated all others. I had spent 6 years admiring Alexander from afar, believing him to be utterly beyond my reach. Now I was his wife, living in his house, bearing his name, and I had absolutely no idea what that meant, or what he expected it to become. Tomorrow, I would begin learning how to be the Marchioness of Ashford. I would start navigating the complex world of servants, household management, and the social obligations that came with my new position. I would prove to Alexander, to myself, and to that sneering society that had witnessed my humiliation that I was not weak, that I was not a victim, that I could transform this strange, unexpected marriage into something worthwhile. But tonight, in the darkness of my new bedchamber, I allowed myself one private moment of honest emotion. I was terrified, grateful, confused, and despite everything, despite the coldness of our arrangement and the mystery of his motives, I felt the smallest flutter of hope, because Alexander Blackwood had looked at me today, really looked at me, and he had seen something worth saving. Now I just needed to discover what, exactly, that something was. The first test of my new identity came exactly 3 days after my wedding, or rather, my weddings, plural, since I had technically been prepared to marry 2 different men on the same morning. Lady Ashford, as I was now called by everyone from Morrison to the greengrocer's boy, was expected to make her first public appearance at the Hendersons' ball. I learned of this obligation over breakfast, that peculiar meal where Alexander and I had fallen into an unexpected routine. He would arrive in the morning room at precisely 8 o'clock, already dressed for the day and carrying whatever correspondence required his immediate attention. I would join him shortly after, and we would share the meal in companionable silence punctuated by brief exchanges about household matters or the day's plans. It was civilized. It was pleasant. It was absolutely nothing like what I had imagined marriage might be. On this particular morning, Alexander set down his coffee cup and informed me, with the same tone one might use to discuss the weather, that we had been invited to the Hendersons' ball, and that our attendance was expected. Required, really, if we hoped to control the narrative surrounding our scandalous marriage. My hand froze halfway to my teacup. A ball. In 3 days. Where every member of the ton who had witnessed my humiliation at St. George's would gather to dissect, analyze, and gossip about the shocking turn of events that had resulted in my elevation from jilted bride to marchioness. Alexander must have seen the color drain from my face, because he continued in a gentler tone. He explained that it would be difficult, certainly, but necessary, that society needed to see us together, united, presenting ourselves as a proper married couple. That if we appeared confident and unbothered by the whispers, the scandal would eventually fade into just another amusing anecdote told over card games and afternoon tea. I asked him, with more sharpness than I had intended, if he truly believed it would be that simple, if he thought I could simply walk into a ballroom full of people who had witnessed my greatest humiliation and pretend that nothing extraordinary had occurred. His response surprised me. He told me that he didn't think it would be simple at all, that he knew exactly how cruel the tongue could be, particularly to women, but he also said that he had faith in my strength, that any woman who could stand at an altar for over an hour, chin held high while being systematically abandoned and mocked, possessed more courage than most of the simpering debutantes who would be at that ball. It was perhaps the most personal thing he had said to me since our marriage, and it bolstered my resolve more than any amount of practical advice could have done. The next 3 days were a whirlwind of preparation that I had not anticipated. Mrs. Winters appeared in my sitting room the very afternoon of Alexander's announcement, accompanied by what seemed like an entire dressmaker's shop worth of fashion plates, fabric samples, and measuring tapes. It seemed that Alexander had commissioned an entirely new wardrobe for me. When I protested, weakly I must admit, because the thought of appearing at a society ball in my 3-year-old blue gown was mortifying, Mrs. Winters informed me that his lordship had been quite insistent, that Lady Ashford must be dressed in a manner befitting her station, and that he would take it as a personal affront if I refused his gift. Gift, as though an entire wardrobe of the finest gowns money could buy was equivalent to a bouquet of flowers or a book of poetry. But I was learning, slowly, that Alexander Blackwood expressed himself through actions rather than words. He might not speak of affection or concern, but he ensured I had everything I needed to succeed in my new role. It was practical, perhaps even cold in its calculation, but it was also undeniably thoughtful. The modiste who arrived was Madame Laurent, a Frenchwoman with an artist's eye and the personality of a benevolent dictator. She took one look at my figure, made several pronouncing statements in rapid French, and immediately began draping fabrics over my shoulders, while her assistants scribbled notes at lightning speed. For the ball, she declared, we would create something that would make every woman in London green with envy. Something that proclaimed Lady Ashford was not merely respectable, but magnificent. The gown that emerged from Madame Laurent's vision was unlike anything I had ever worn. It was crafted from silk, the color of midnight, with an overlay of gossamer fabric that caught the light and shimmered like starlight. The neckline was daring by my standards, lower than I would have chosen myself, but which Madame Laurent insisted was perfectly proper for a married woman of fashion. Tiny crystals had been sewn along the bodice and hem, and when I moved, I sparkled. When I saw myself in the mirror on the evening of the ball, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. Sarah had dressed my hair in an elegant style that made my neck look longer, my features more refined. I wore sapphires at my throat and ears, Alexander's mother's jewels, Morrison had informed me when he presented the velvet case, kept for the Marquess of Ashford. I looked like I belonged, like I had been born to this life of silk and jewels and grand houses. It was terrifying how much I wanted that to be true. Alexander was waiting for me at the bottom of the grand staircase when I descended. He had been consulting with Morrison about something, but he stopped mid-sentence when he saw me. For just a moment, his carefully controlled expression slipped, and I saw something in his eyes that made my breath catch. Admiration, appreciation. Or was I, once again, projecting my foolish hopes onto a man who had married me out of duty rather than desire? He told me I looked beautiful. Just those 3 words, spoken quietly, but they meant more to me than he could possibly know. The carriage ride to the Hendersons' townhouse was conducted in near silence. I could feel my anxiety building with each passing street, each revolution of the wheels that brought us closer to my first public appearance as Lady Ashford. Alexander seemed to sense my nervousness, because halfway through the journey, he reached across the space between us and briefly squeezed my gloved hand. He reminded me that I was not alone in this, that we would face the gossips together, and that if anyone dared to be openly rude, he would ensure they regretted it. There was something almost fierce in his tone, protective in a way that made my heart flutter foolishly in my chest. The Hendersons' ballroom was ablaze with candlelight, and already crowded with society's elite when we arrived. The moment our names were announced, the most honorable the Marquess of Ashford and the Marchioness of Ashford, a hush fell over the assembled guests that was more eloquent than any words could have been. Every eye turned toward us. Every fan stopped its fluttering. Every conversation died mid-sentence. I had faced humiliation before, standing at that altar, but this was different. This was walking voluntarily into a room full of predators who had already scented blood and were eager for more. Alexander offered me his arm, and I took it, grateful for his solid presence beside me. We descended the stairs into the ballroom with measured steps, and I kept my chin high and my expression serene, even as my heart threatened to beat its way out of my chest. The whispers started immediately, behind fans, behind raised hands, behind the pretense of polite conversation, but whispers nonetheless, spreading through the room like ripples in a pond. Can you believe? Scandalous thing I've ever. Wonder what he sees in her. Must have trapped him somehow. Lady Hutchinson, that venomous creature who had so enjoyed my humiliation at the church, was holding court near the refreshment table. Her voice, as always, carried further than it should have. She was speculating loudly about how long such an unsuitable marriage could possibly last, how Alexander would surely come to regret his impulsive gallantry, how I must be quite pleased with myself for engineering such an advantageous match. I felt Alexander stiffen beside me, felt the tension radiating from him, but before he could respond, and something in his expression suggested his response would have been memorable, I placed my hand more firmly on his arm and steered us toward Lady Worthington instead. Lady Worthington was a formidable matron in her 60s, a widow who controlled one of London's most influential salons, and whose opinion could make or break a reputation. She also, I happened to know from my years of careful observation at society events, despised Lady Hutchinson with a passion born of a decades-old rivalry over a long-dead duke. I approached her with a confidence I did not feel, and thanked her for her kind note of congratulations on my marriage. In truth, no such note had arrived, but Lady Worthington was far too polite to contradict me publicly. Instead, she looked me up and down with sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, then smiled with genuine warmth. She told me that my gown was exquisite, that the sapphires suited me admirably, and that she hoped I would call upon her the following week for tea. It was an olive branch, an offer of alliance from one of society's most powerful women, and I accepted it with gratitude that was entirely real. Alexander handled his own share of the social maneuvering with practiced ease. He refused to appear defensive or apologetic about our marriage. When Lord Pemberton's name was raised, as it inevitably was, Alexander simply stated that some men knew the value of what they possessed, and some did not, and he was grateful to fall into the former category. It was perfectly said, implying without stating outright that Pemberton was a fool, and that I was a prize worth having. We danced the first waltz together, and if I had thought standing beside Alexander was overwhelming, it was nothing compared to being held in his arms as we moved through the steps. He was an excellent dancer, leading with confident grace, and I found myself following his movements as though we had practiced together for years, rather than never having danced together before. As we turned through the candlelit ballroom, I was acutely aware of every point where his hand touched my waist, where my hand rested on his shoulder. This close, I could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, could smell the subtle scent of his cologne, could feel the warmth of him through our gloves. He asked me if I was managing well, and I told him honestly that it was difficult, but that I refused to let them see me break. Something flashed in his eyes at that. Approval, perhaps, or respect. He told me that I was doing magnificently, that I held myself like a queen, and that anyone watching us would see only a couple perfectly suited to each other. It should have been merely a compliment, words meant to bolster my confidence. But the way he said it, the intensity in his gaze as he looked down at me, made it feel like something more. The evening progressed, and slowly, I began to relax. Not every guest was hostile. Lady Worthington had clearly spread the word that I was under her protection, and several other influential women made a point of greeting me warmly. Younger ladies, perhaps envious but intrigued, found excuses to be introduced. And the gentlemen, once they saw that Alexander was not embarrassed by his choice, began to treat me with the respect due to a marchioness. But it was the encounter with Miss Arabella Thornton, Lord Pemberton's younger sister, that proved most illuminating. She approached me during a lull in the dancing, her pretty face pale and her eyes suspiciously red-rimmed. She apologized, for her brother's abominable behavior. She told me that she had been horrified when she learned what Charles had planned, that she had tried to dissuade him, but that he had been determined on his course for reasons she still didn't fully understand. Reasons. That word again, implying depths to this story that I had not yet plumbed. I thanked her for her kindness and assured her that I held no ill will toward her. It wasn't her fault that her brother was a coward. And in truth, I told her with more honesty than was perhaps wise, I was beginning to think his abandonment was a blessing rather than a curse. She looked at me with something like wonder, then glanced toward where Alexander stood conversing with several other gentlemen. She said that she thought I might be right about that, and that anyone with eyes could see that the Marquess of Ashford looked at me in a way her brother never had. I wanted desperately to ask her what she meant by that, to demand clarification of what she had seen in Alexander's expression that I had been too close to notice. But before I could form the question, she was claimed by her mother and swept away into the crowd. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of introductions, polite conversation, and careful navigation of social intricacies. By the time Alexander and I finally took our leave, I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness, and everything to do with the emotional toll of performing for hours on end. In the carriage on the way home, Alexander told me that I had been perfect, that I had handled myself with grace and intelligence, had made allies where he had expected only challenges, and had proven beyond any doubt that I was suited to be his Marchioness. I thanked him, but I also confessed that I had been terrified the entire time, that I had spent the evening waiting for someone to publicly challenge my right to be there, to call me an imposter, to expose me as the fraud I sometimes felt myself to be. Alexander was quiet for a moment, and in the dim light of the carriage, I could barely make out his expression. Then he said something that I would remember long after that night ended. He told me that everyone in that ballroom was playing a part, that society was nothing but an elaborate performance where everyone pretended to be more confident, more secure, more certain than they actually were. The only difference between me and them was that I had the courage to acknowledge my own uncertainty, while they hid behind masks of false superiority. It was, in its own way, one of the kindest things anyone had ever said to me. When we arrived home and Alexander escorted me to my chambers, he paused at my door, as he had every night since our marriage. He wished me good night, told me I should be proud of what I had accomplished, and then, just before turning toward his own rooms, he did something unexpected. He lifted my hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to my gloved knuckles, just as he had done at our wedding. But this time, there was no audience. This time it was just the two of us in the quiet hallway, and the gesture felt intensely personal. He told me, very softly, that he had meant what he said earlier, that I had been perfect tonight, and that he was, the word seemed to catch in his throat, proud to call me his wife. Then he was gone, disappeared into his own chambers, leaving me standing alone in the hallway with my heart racing and my mind spinning with questions. I had survived my first public appearance as Lady Ashford. I had faced down the gossips and emerged, if not victorious, then at least undefeated. I had proven to Alexander and to myself that I could play this part he had thrust upon me. But as I prepared for bed that night, one thought dominated all others. What if I no longer wanted to simply play a part? What if I wanted this marriage, this life, this man, to be real? And what would I do if Alexander Blackwood never wanted the same? The weeks following the Hendersons' ball passed in a curious blend of routine and discovery. I settled into my role as Lady Ashford with a determination that surprised even myself. The household, which had seemed so overwhelming at first, gradually became familiar territory. I learned which servants could be trusted with delicate tasks, which tradesmen provided the best quality goods, and how to manage the endless stream of social obligations that came with my new position. But it was the unexpected moments, the small, unplanned encounters with Alexander, that truly changed everything. It began with the gardens. I had taken to walking the grounds each morning after breakfast, partly for exercise and partly for the peace it provided. The gardens at Ashford House were magnificent, carefully designed over generations to provide year-round beauty. In late June, the roses were at their peak, their heavy blooms perfuming the air with a sweetness that was almost intoxicating. I was examining a particularly lovely specimen, a deep crimson bloom with petals like velvet, when I heard footsteps on the gravel path behind me. I turned to find Alexander approaching, still dressed for riding in boots and breeches, his dark hair slightly mussed from the wind. He looked surprised to find me there, as though he had thought this time and space belonged solely to him. He apologized for intruding on my solitude, and I assured him that the gardens were his after all, and he could hardly be intruding in his own home. Something in his expression shifted at that, a small crack in his usual composure. He told me that they were our gardens now, not his alone, and that he was pleased to see me enjoying them. We stood there for a moment in awkward silence, and then Alexander did something I had not expected. He asked if I would like company on my walk, or if I preferred to be alone. It was the first time he had voluntarily sought out my company beyond the formal requirements of meals and social obligations, and I found myself agreeing before my rational mind could interfere. We walked together through the manicured paths, and gradually, conversation began to flow more naturally than it ever had over the breakfast table. Alexander told me about the history of the gardens, how his grandmother had designed this particular section, how his mother had added the fountain near the east wall. He spoke of his childhood, playing among these very roses while his tutors despaired of ever civilizing him. It was a glimpse into a past I had never imagined. Alexander as a boy, wild and unruly, before duty and title had shaped him into the controlled man he had become. I found myself sharing my own memories in return, not of grand estates or family legacies, but of smaller, simpler things. The tiny garden behind our townhouse in Bloomsbury, where my mother had grown herbs and taught me to identify them by scent. The way my sister and I would make crowns from daisies on summer afternoons. The happiness that had existed before my father's poor decisions had stolen it away. Alexander listened with an attention that felt genuine, not merely polite. When I mentioned my sister, Catherine, he asked after her well-being. I told him that she was well, that thanks to his settlement of our family's debts, she would now have the season she deserved, free from the shadow of financial ruin. He seemed pleased by this, and told me that if there was anything more he could do to assist Catherine's prospects, I had only to ask. It was a generous offer, more generous than our arrangement strictly required, and I thanked him with a warmth I couldn't quite suppress. As we walked, our hands occasionally brushed, accidental contacts that sent small shocks of awareness through me. Once, when I stumbled slightly on an uneven stone, Alexander caught my elbow to steady me, and the touch lingered a moment longer than strictly necessary. When we finally parted ways, he to his study, and I to attend to household matters, I found myself anticipating our next encounter in a way that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with a growing, dangerous hope. The morning walks became a ritual after that. Not every day, but often enough that I began to listen for the sound of Alexander's return from riding, timing my own departure for the gardens to coincide with his. If he noticed this careful choreography, he never mentioned it. Instead, he simply appeared beside me as though by chance, and we would walk together, talking about everything and nothing. I learned that Alexander was not the cold aristocrat he appeared to be in public. He had a dry wit that caught me off guard, making me laugh when I least expected it. He was widely read, and could discuss poetry and philosophy with equal ease. And beneath his perfect manners and controlled demeanor, there was a man who cared deeply about things that most of his peers dismissed. The welfare of his tenants, the education of children in the village, the proper stewardship of the land and resources entrusted to his care. But it was during a visit to one of his tenant farms that I truly began to see the man behind the title. Alexander had mentioned during breakfast that he needed to visit the Hendricks family, tenant farmers whose situation had become dire after Mr. Hendricks had broken his leg in a farming accident. The injury meant he couldn't work, couldn't bring in the harvest, couldn't provide for his wife and 4 young children. I asked if I might accompany him, expecting refusal or at least surprise. Instead, Alexander looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read and told me that he would welcome my company. The Hendricks family lived in a modest cottage on the edge of Alexander's property, several miles from the main house. As our carriage approached, I could see the neglected fields, crops that should have been tended but showed signs of struggle. Children played in the dusty yard, their clothes patched but clean, their faces thin but not yet desperate. Mrs. Hendricks came out to greet us, her curtsy awkward from obvious exhaustion. She addressed Alexander with a deference that bordered on fear, clearly expecting judgment or worse. But Alexander's demeanor as he spoke to her was gentle, concerned, utterly lacking in the hauteur I had seen him employ with social equals, who annoyed him. He asked after her husband's condition, listened carefully to her worried explanation of their circumstances, and then did something that left me speechless. He told her that the estate would cover the cost of a doctor from London to properly set and care for Mr. Hendricks's leg, that he would send men to help with the harvest so that the crops wouldn't be lost, that she need not worry about the rent, until her husband was fully recovered and able to work again. Mrs. Hendricks actually wept with relief, thanking him with a fervor that clearly embarrassed Alexander. He deflected her gratitude with characteristic awkwardness, then asked if he might see Mr. Hendricks to assess his condition himself. While Alexander spoke with the injured farmer, I found myself in the cottage kitchen with Mrs. Hendricks and her children. The eldest, a girl of perhaps 10, was attempting to prepare a meal with limited ingredients and even more limited skill. She was trying so hard, her small face set with determined concentration, that my heart ached. I found myself rolling up my sleeves, metaphorically, at least, and helping her salvage the meal. It was strange, this moment of domesticity, in the midst of my new life of luxury, but it felt real in a way that many of my recent experiences had not. Mrs. Hendricks told me, as we worked, that his lordship was a good master, that he was firm but fair, demanding but generous, and that his father had been neither of those things. The previous Marquess had been a tyrant who viewed his tenants as little more than convenient labor. Alexander had spent his first years as Marquess quietly undoing years of neglect and cruelty, earning loyalty through actions rather than demanding it through fear. When we finally departed, after Alexander had arranged for everything the family needed and more, I found myself looking at him with new eyes. This was not a man who had married me out of whim or cold calculation. This was a man who carried the weight of responsibility seriously, who saw those beneath his station as human beings deserving of compassion. In the carriage on the return journey, I told him that what he had done for the Hendricks family was remarkable, that many men of his position would have simply evicted them and found new tenants. Alexander looked almost uncomfortable with the praise. He told me that there was nothing remarkable about treating people decently, that the accident could have happened to anyone, and that loyalty was earned through fair treatment, not demanded through cruelty. Then he said something that struck me deeply. He told me that his father had been a hard man, concerned only with profit and prestige, that Alexander had watched him destroy lives through indifference and had vowed never to become the same kind of man, that the title came with responsibility, not just privilege, and he took that responsibility seriously. It was the most personal thing he had shared with me, and I treasured it. I asked him, emboldened by the moment's intimacy, why he had chosen to tell me this, why he had brought me along to witness his kindness, when he could have simply gone alone. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying me with that intensity that always made my breath catch. Then he told me that he wanted me to understand who he was, that our marriage might have begun under extraordinary circumstances, but that he hoped, in time, we might build something genuine between us, that he valued my intelligence and wanted me to see all aspects of his life, not just the polished public performance. My heart was racing. This was as close as Alexander had come to acknowledging that our relationship might be more than merely a convenient arrangement. But before I could respond, before I could find the words to express the tangle of emotions his confession had stirred in me, we arrived back at Ashford House. The moment, like so many others, passed without resolution. But that evening, when I entered the library seeking a book before bed, I found Alexander already there. He looked up from his reading with surprise, then set aside his book and rose to greet me. We stood there in the soft lamplight, and for a heartbeat, I thought he might say something significant, something that would finally bridge the gap between formal courtesy and genuine feeling. Instead, he asked if I needed help selecting a book, and the moment dissolved like morning mist. Yet as he guided me through the shelves, recommending volumes and sharing his thoughts on various authors, his hand occasionally brushed mine. Each touch felt deliberate, lingering just a fraction too long to be entirely accidental, and when our fingers finally tangled together while both reaching for the same volume, neither of us pulled away immediately. Alexander looked down at our joined hands, then up at my face, and what I saw in his eyes made my breath stop. Heat, longing, and something that might have been fear. He told me, his voice rougher than usual, that he should let me rest, but he made no move to release my hand. Instead, we stood there in the lamplight, connected by that simple touch, until finally, reluctantly, he stepped back. He wished me good night, and I fled to my chambers with my heart pounding and my carefully constructed defenses crumbling. Because I was no longer simply admiring Alexander Blackwood from afar, I was falling in love with him, with his hidden kindness, his dry humor, his moments of vulnerability. I was falling in love with my own husband, and I had no idea if he would ever allow himself to fall in love with me in return. The armor of formality and distance that had characterized our marriage was cracking, but whether what emerged would be genuine connection or simply further disappointment remained terrifyingly uncertain. The invitation to the Carmichael ball arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered with the rest of the post, and looking entirely innocuous. It was Lady Carmichael's annual midsummer celebration, one of the season's most anticipated events, held in her magnificent townhouse, with its famous ballroom and even more famous guest list. I had been Lady Ashford for nearly 2 months by then, and I had settled into a comfortable rhythm with society. The initial scandal of my marriage had faded into the background noise of London gossip, replaced by fresher scandals and newer targets. I had allies now, Lady Worthington chief among them, and I had proven myself capable of navigating the treacherous waters of high society with grace and intelligence. I should have known that nothing in my new life would remain comfortable for long. Alexander and I were in the morning room when Morrison brought the invitation. Alexander opened it, scanned the contents with his usual efficiency, and then looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. He told me that we had been invited to the Carmichael ball, which was no surprise given our station. What was surprising, and what made Alexander's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, was that Lord Pemberton would also be in attendance. It would be the first time since my wedding day that I would be in the same room as the man who had abandoned me at the altar. My first instinct was to refuse, to plead illness or prior engagement, or any of the dozens of acceptable excuses that would allow me to avoid what promised to be an excruciating evening. But even as the thought formed, I rejected it. I had not spent the past 2 months building my reputation and proving my worth only to hide from Charles Thornton like a frightened child. I told Alexander that we should accept the invitation, that I refused to let Pemberton's presence dictate my social calendar or make me appear weak. Something flashed in Alexander's eyes, approval mixed with concern. He asked if I was certain, reminding me that no one would fault me for choosing to avoid such an uncomfortable encounter. But I was adamant. I would attend, I would hold my head high, and I would show Lord Pemberton exactly what he had lost through his own cowardice. Alexander studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He told me that if we were to do this, we would do it properly, that we would arrive fashionably late, making an entrance that would remind everyone in that ballroom of exactly who we were, and that if Pemberton dared to approach me with anything less than the most abject apology, Alexander would ensure he regretted it. There was something almost possessive in his tone, protective in a way that made my traitorous heart flutter with hope. The week leading up to the ball passed with agonizing slowness. I found myself alternating between confidence and terror, between determination to face Pemberton and an almost overwhelming desire to flee London entirely. Alexander seemed to sense my internal struggle, and he made a point of being present more than usual, joining me for tea in the afternoons, suggesting evening walks in the gardens, finding small excuses to seek out my company. It was during one of these walks, 2 days before the ball, that I finally voiced the question that had been haunting me since the invitation arrived. I asked Alexander why Pemberton had done it. Why had he gone through with the engagement, let me prepare for the wedding, allowed my family to believe we were saved from ruin, only to abandon me at the altar? What possible motivation could justify such calculated cruelty? Alexander was silent for so long that I thought he might not answer. We had paused near the fountain, and the sound of falling water filled the space between us. Then he told me something that made my blood run cold. He said that he had recently learned the truth about Pemberton's actions, information that had come to him through channels he didn't specify, but which he believed to be reliable. Pemberton had never intended to marry me. The entire engagement had been a scheme of revenge against my father, for a gambling debt and some perceived slight that had occurred years before. Pemberton had planned from the beginning to humiliate me publicly, to destroy what remained of my family's reputation, as punishment for my father's sins. I felt as though I had been struck. It was one thing to be abandoned by a man who had gotten cold feet or found a better prospect. It was quite another to realize that I had been the target of deliberate malicious cruelty, that my humiliation had been carefully orchestrated, that every moment of that awful morning had been exactly what Pemberton had intended. Alexander must have seen the devastation on my face, because he reached out and took my hand, a gesture of comfort that was becoming less rare, but no less affecting. He told me that he was sorry I had to learn such an ugly truth, But he also said that he was grateful Pemberton had revealed his true nature before I was legally bound to him, that whatever pain I felt now was preferable to a lifetime of marriage to such a contemptible man. I asked Alexander, my voice barely above a whisper, how he had learned this information, and more importantly, when he had known. His answer changed everything. Alexander told me that he had discovered Pemberton's plan 3 days before my scheduled wedding, that a business associate had mentioned it in passing, thinking it an amusing bit of gossip, that Alexander had immediately begun investigating and had confirmed the truth the night before the wedding itself, that he had arrived at St. George's that morning not on impulse, but with full knowledge of what Pemberton intended to do, that his intervention had been planned, deliberate, his only means of protecting me from even greater humiliation while preserving as much of my dignity as possible under the circumstances. I stood there in the garden, hand still held in Alexander's, trying to process this revelation. He had known what was going to happen to me, and he had come to the church prepared to intervene. His offer of marriage had not been impulse or even simple gallantry. It had been a calculated rescue, planned and executed with precision. But that raised the most important question of all. Why? Why would Alexander Blackwood go to such lengths for a woman he barely knew? What had motivated him to not only discover this plot, but to sacrifice his own freedom to prevent my humiliation? I asked him this directly, with none of the polite deflection that had characterized so many of our previous conversations. I told him that I deserved the truth, that after 2 months of marriage and growing intimacy, he owed me an honest explanation. Alexander looked at me with an expression that was part resignation, part something else I couldn't quite name. He told me that the truth was complicated, that his reasons were multiple and overlapping, but that the simplest explanation was that he could not stand by and watch such an injustice occur when he had the power to prevent it. It was not quite the declaration I had been hoping for, but it was more honest than he had been before. The evening of the Carmichael ball arrived with summer heat that made the air thick and oppressive. Sarah dressed me in one of my new gowns, emerald silk that Madame Laurent had declared brought out the green flecks in my eyes. The bodice was embroidered with gold thread in patterns that resembled vines and flowers, and I wore the Ashford emeralds at my throat and wrists. I looked like a woman who belonged at the highest levels of society. I looked like a marchioness. I looked like someone who could face her demons without flinching. I desperately hoped that appearance matched reality. Alexander came to collect me from my chambers personally, rather than meeting me downstairs, and when he saw me, his eyes darkened in a way that made heat pool in my stomach. He told me I looked magnificent, and the way he said it made it sound like truth rather than polite flattery. In the carriage, Alexander went over the plan one final time. We would arrive late enough to make an entrance, early enough not to appear rudely tardy. We would circulate through the ballroom, greeting friends and allies, and if Pemberton approached, Alexander would handle it, unless I specifically indicated I wished to address him myself. I told Alexander that I appreciated his protective instincts, but that I needed to face Pemberton directly, that I needed him to see that his cruelty had not destroyed me, that I had not only survived, but thrived. Alexander looked as though he wanted to argue, but instead, he simply nodded and told me he would be at my side every moment. The Carmichael ballroom was even more magnificent than its reputation suggested. Crystal chandeliers cast prisms of light across the polished floor. Flowers in massive arrangements perfumed the air, and the cream of London society was assembled in their finest clothing, creating a sea of silk and jewels and carefully arranged hair. Our arrival caused the expected stir. Conversations paused mid-sentence as heads turned to watch the Marquess and Marchioness of Ashford make their entrance. I kept my hand on Alexander's arm, my spine straight, my expression serene, even as my heart hammered against my ribs. And then I saw him. Lord Pemberton stood near the far wall, holding a glass of champagne and laughing at something his companion had said. He looked exactly as I remembered, handsome in a conventional way, well-dressed, utterly unremarkable except for the monumental cowardice that defined his character. The moment he saw me, his laughter died, the color drained from his face, and I watched with grim satisfaction as he realized that I was not the broken, humiliated creature he had undoubtedly imagined. I was Lady Ashford, wife to one of England's most powerful peers, and I was looking at him with all the disdain he deserved. We circulated through the ballroom as planned, and I was gratified by the warmth of the reception we received. Lady Worthington kissed my cheek and told me I looked radiant. Several other ladies complimented my gown. Gentlemen bowed respectfully to Alexander and to me. We were, to all appearances, a perfectly matched couple, enjoying an evening's entertainment. But I was acutely aware of Pemberton's presence, of his eyes following me across the room, of the way he seemed to be working up the courage to approach. When it finally happened, I was speaking with Lady Worthington about a charity project she was organizing. Alexander had stepped away momentarily to greet an old friend, though I noticed he kept me in his line of sight. And Pemberton, seeing his opportunity, approached with steps that looked almost hesitant. He greeted me formally, using my married title, and asked if he might have a word in private. The sheer audacity of the request left me momentarily speechless, but I recovered quickly and told him, in a voice loud enough to be overheard by those nearby, that anything he had to say to me could be said publicly, as he had apparently found public forums so appropriate for important communications. The barb hit home. Pemberton flinched, and several people nearby, including Lady Worthington, made no attempt to hide their interest in this exchange. What followed was perhaps the most satisfying moment of my entire life. Pemberton attempted to explain himself, to offer justifications for his actions that were so transparently self-serving as to be almost laughable. He spoke of cold feet, of being overwhelmed, of not being ready for marriage. He made no mention of the calculated cruelty, the planned humiliation, the revenge scheme that had motivated his actions. I let him finish his pathetic speech, and then I responded with a calm I genuinely felt. I told him that I thanked him for his cowardice, that abandoning me at the altar was, in retrospect, the greatest favor he could have done me, that I had thought I was consigning myself to a marriage of convenience and duty, but instead, I had found something far better, a partnership with a man who was his superior in every conceivable way. The nearby guests were no longer even pretending not to listen. A small crowd had gathered, sensing drama, and I was acutely aware of being the center of attention, but I didn't care. This moment was mine, and I would not waste it. Pemberton's face had gone from pale to flushed, and he attempted to respond, to defend himself against my words. But before he could speak, Alexander appeared at my side. I hadn't heard him approach, but suddenly he was there, solid and imposing, looking at Pemberton with an expression of such cold contempt that the other man actually took a step backward. What Alexander said next would be repeated in drawing rooms across London for weeks afterward. He told Pemberton that he should thank him for his cowardice as well, that Pemberton's inability to recognize the extraordinary woman he had been privileged to court was a gift beyond measure, that Alexander had spent the past 2 months discovering depths of intelligence, grace, and strength in his wife that a man like Pemberton could never have appreciated or deserved. Then Alexander did something that shocked everyone present, myself included. He spoke directly to the gathered crowd, making no pretense that this was a private conversation. He told them all that his marriage to me was not born of pity or impulse, but of recognition, that he had admired me from afar for years, but had believed himself unable to court me due to circumstances, that Pemberton's actions, reprehensible as they were, had given him the opportunity to claim the woman he had long desired as his wife. The ballroom erupted in whispers. This was a declaration, public and unmistakable, that Alexander valued me not merely as a convenient spouse, but as someone he actively wanted. It transformed the narrative of our marriage from scandalous rescue to romantic triumph. But more than the public vindication, more than the satisfaction of watching Pemberton slink away in humiliation, what affected me most was the look in Alexander's eyes as he made his declaration. There was something raw there, something honest and vulnerable that suggested his words were not merely for show. He believed what he said, or at least he was beginning to. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. We danced together multiple times, more than propriety strictly dictated, and each waltz felt like a conversation conducted through touch rather than words. Alexander held me closer than necessary, his hand warm through the silk of my gown, his eyes never leaving my face. When we finally departed, well after midnight, I was exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure. I had faced Pemberton and emerged victorious. I had witnessed Alexander defending me with a passion I had never expected, and I had heard him speak words that suggested our marriage might be transforming into something real. In the carriage on the way home, Alexander took my hand without asking permission, threading his fingers through mine. He told me I had been magnificent, that he was proud of how I had handled Pemberton, that he had meant every word he said. I asked him, emboldened by the evening's success and the champagne I had consumed, which words he meant specifically. The words about admiring me for years? About desiring me as his wife? Alexander looked at me in the darkness of the carriage, and what I saw in his eyes made my breath stop. He told me that he had meant all of it, every word, and that perhaps it was time we stopped pretending that our marriage was merely convenient and acknowledged what it was becoming. Before I could respond, before I could process the implications of his words, we arrived at Ashford House. The moment hung between us, pregnant with possibility, as Alexander helped me descend from the carriage. He escorted me to my chambers as always, but this time, when we reached my door, he didn't immediately withdraw. Instead, he raised my hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to my bare wrist, just above where my glove ended. It was an intimate gesture, far more personal than anything we had shared before, and it sent heat racing through my veins. He told me good night, his voice rough with something that might have been restrained desire, and then he was gone, leaving me trembling in the hallway with the imprint of his lips burning on my skin. Something had shifted between us that evening. The careful distance we had maintained, the polite formality that had governed our interactions, had cracked irreparably. What would emerge from those cracks remained to be seen, but as I lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, replaying every moment of the evening, I allowed myself to hope. Hope that Alexander's words had been true. Hope that what I felt for him might be returned. Hope that the marriage born from scandal and necessity might transform into the love I had never dared to dream possible. The armor was cracking, and beneath it, something beautiful was beginning to emerge. The days following the Carmichael ball were charged with an electricity I could almost taste. Alexander and I circled each other like dancers learning new steps, hesitant, anticipating, waiting for someone to make the decisive move that would either bring us together or confirm the distance between us as permanent. He found more excuses to seek my company. I discovered reasons to linger in spaces where I knew he would be. Our morning walks became longer, our conversations deeper, our silences more comfortable yet somehow more fraught with unspoken questions. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening, 5 days after the ball. I had developed a habit of reading in the library before bed. It was a peaceful routine, sitting in one of the comfortable chairs near the fireplace with a book and a cup of tea, letting the day's tensions dissolve into the quiet of evening. Alexander knew of this habit, had occasionally joined me, sitting in companionable silence with his own book. But this particular evening, I had assumed he was out at his club. I was wrong. I entered the library to find him already there, not reading, but standing at the window that overlooked the darkened gardens. He still wore his evening clothes from whatever engagement he had attended, but his cravat was loosened, and there was something in his posture, a tension, a weariness, that suggested whatever thoughts occupied his mind were not peaceful ones. I almost withdrew, thinking he wanted privacy, but at the sound of my entrance, he turned, and what I saw in his face stopped me in my tracks. He looked vulnerable. That was the only word for it. The careful mask he wore in public, even the more relaxed version he showed me in private, had slipped entirely, revealing something raw underneath. He told me he was glad I had come, that he had been hoping I would, that there were things he needed to say, and he had been trying to find the courage to say them. My heart began to race. I set down my book and tea with hands that trembled slightly, then moved to stand near him, close but not touching, giving him space to speak. Alexander was silent for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. Then he began to talk, and what emerged was a confession that explained everything and complicated everything in equal measure. He told me that his declaration at the Carmichael ball had been true, that he had admired me for years, since my first season 6 years prior. He described, with surprising detail, the moment he had first truly noticed me, at the Pemberton ball, ironically enough, when I had been 18 and still full of hope for my future. I had been standing on the terrace, he said, alone and apparently content with my own company while others clustered in gossiping groups. When a younger debutante had stumbled and nearly fallen down the steps, I had been the first to reach her, had helped her up with kindness rather than mockery, had adjusted her dress so that no one would see the tear in her hem. It had been a small act of compassion, unremarked by most of the guests, but Alexander had noticed. He had watched me after that. He confessed with something like embarrassment, not constantly, not obsessively, but with an awareness that became impossible to ignore. He had admired the way I treated servants with respect, the intelligence I displayed in conversation when others bothered to listen, the grace with which I navigated increasingly difficult financial circumstances without losing my dignity or kindness. But he had never acted on his admiration, he continued, his voice rough with emotion. He was a Marquess, one of England's most eligible bachelors, and I was— he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I was a woman he believed he could not approach without causing harm. I didn't understand. I told him so, my voice barely above a whisper. Alexander turned from the window to face me fully, and the look in his eyes was anguished. He explained that his father had died 3 years prior, leaving behind not just the title and estates, but also a reputation for cruelty and exploitation. The previous Marquess had been known for seducing young women of lesser means, making promises he never intended to keep, ruining reputations and lives with casual disregard. Alexander had spent his first years as Marquess trying to distance himself from his father's legacy to prove that he was a different kind of man, and he had been terrified that if he approached me, a woman without fortune or powerful connections to protect her, society would assume the worst, would see it as the new Marquess following in his father's predatory footsteps, would destroy my reputation before I even had a chance to refuse him. So he had stayed away, he told me. He had admired me from a distance, and convinced himself it was for my own good. He had watched me become engaged to Pemberton, and felt his heart break, but told himself that at least I would be settled, protected, free from the taint of association with the Ashford name. And then he had learned of Pemberton's plan. The business associate who had mentioned it as amusing gossip had no idea that Alexander knew me, cared about me, would be devastated by this information. When Alexander had confirmed the truth through his own investigation, he had been consumed with rage unlike anything he had ever experienced. The idea that I would be publicly humiliated, that my kindness and grace would be repaid with calculated cruelty, was unbearable. He had come to the church that morning with a plan, he told me. If Pemberton failed to appear, Alexander would intervene. He would offer me marriage not as pity, but as protection. And if society judged him for it, if they assumed the worst about his motives, at least I would be safe. At least I would have a title and position that would shield me from the worst of the scandal. What he had not anticipated, he said with something that might have been a laugh or a sob, was that marrying me would be the most selfish thing he had ever done, because now he had me in his home, in his life, and he was tormented daily by the knowledge that I had married him out of desperation rather than choice, that I might never feel for him what he had felt for me all these years, that he had trapped us both in a marriage where his love was real while mine was, what? Gratitude? Duty? Perhaps eventually affection, but never the passionate devotion he felt and could not seem to suppress. I stood frozen, my mind reeling from this avalanche of confession. Alexander loved me, had loved me for years. Every careful distance, every formal politeness, every moment of controlled interaction had been him restraining himself, protecting me from what he feared society would say about his interest, and he thought I didn't love him in return. The absurdity of it broke through my shock. Here we were, two people who had been circling each other for years, both convinced the other could never return their feelings, both trapped in a marriage that was everything we wanted, but were too afraid to claim. I started to laugh. It wasn't quite hysterical, but it was close, and Alexander looked alarmed. He asked if I was well, if his confession had disturbed me too much, if he should summon someone. I told him to stop talking. Then, before I could lose my courage, I closed the distance between us and took his face in my hands. I told him that he was the most intelligent man I knew, and also, apparently, the most foolish, that I had admired him since I was 18 years old, that I had positioned myself at balls where I might catch a glimpse of him, had memorized the sound of his laugh, had built entire fantasies around a man I thought would never notice me, that when he appeared in that church, when he extended his hand to me in my moment of greatest humiliation, I had felt not just relief, but a fierce, terrified joy, because the impossible was happening. Alexander's eyes had gone wide, his hands coming up to grip my wrists as though to verify I was real, and this moment was actually occurring. I told him that every day of our marriage had been a kind of exquisite torture, being close to him, living in his house, sharing meals and conversations and small intimacies, all while believing he saw me as nothing more than an obligation he had chosen to honor. that watching him be kind to tenants and gentle with servants and protective of me had only deepened feelings I had been trying desperately to suppress. I told him that I loved him, that I had loved him for years, and would love him for all the years to come, if he would have me not just as a wife in name but in truth. For a moment, Alexander simply stared at me, his expression shifting through disbelief, hope, and finally something that looked like joy so intense it was almost painful. Then he was kissing me, his lips finding mine with a desperation that matched the feelings I had been suppressing for months. It was nothing like the chaste kiss at our wedding. This was passion unleashed, years of restraint crumbling in an instant. His hands moved from my wrists to frame my face, then slid into my hair, destroying Sarah's careful arrangement without either of us caring. My own hands clutched at his shoulders, pulling him closer, needing to eliminate every inch of space between us. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alexander rested his forehead against mine. He told me he loved me, said it over and over, as though making up for all the times he had bitten back those words. He loved me. He had always loved me. He would always love me. I laughed and cried simultaneously, overwhelmed by the sheer relief of it. All those months of uncertainty, of wondering if he could ever see me as more than a convenient wife, dissolved in an instant. We talked for hours after that, still holding each other, unwilling to break physical contact, now that we had finally allowed ourselves to touch freely. Alexander told me more about his years of silent admiration, about specific moments when he had wanted to approach me but hadn't. I shared my own memories of watching him, of building hope around small interactions that I had thought meant nothing to him. He told me that our morning walks had become the highlight of his days, that he had timed his return from riding specifically to encounter me in the gardens, that every accidental touch, every lingering glance had been deliberate on his part, small ways of expressing feelings he thought he had to suppress. I confessed that I had done the same, that I had orchestrated our meetings as carefully as he had, hoping for moments of connection while fearing I was reading too much into simple courtesy. We agreed, both complete fools who had wasted months being miserable when we could have been happy. Eventually, reluctantly, we acknowledged that it was well past midnight and we should retire, but neither of us wanted to separate, to return to our respective chambers in the careful distance we had maintained. Alexander asked, his voice hesitant despite everything that had passed between us, if I would prefer to continue with our current arrangement of separate chambers, or if I might want something different. He made it clear that the choice was mine, that he would never pressure me, but that he hoped. His voice trailed off, but the look in his eyes completed the sentence. I told him that I had no interest in separate chambers, that I wanted to be his wife in every sense of the word, that I had waited 6 years for him, and I was done waiting. The heat that flared in Alexander's eyes at my words made my breath catch. He asked if I was certain, giving me one last chance to reconsider. I answered by taking his hand and leading him toward the door that connected my chambers to his. What followed was everything I had dreamed of during those long months of restrained proximity. Alexander loved me with a tenderness and passion that left me breathless, transformed our marriage from convenient arrangement to genuine union. Every touch was a confession, every kiss a promise, every whispered endearment a piece of his soul given freely into my keeping. Afterward, as I lay in his arms in the bed we now shared, I felt a completeness I had never imagined possible. Alexander held me as though I were something precious, his fingers tracing idle patterns on my skin, his lips pressing occasional kisses to my hair. He told me that he had been a fool to wait so long to confess the truth, that we had wasted so much time being miserable when we could have been happy. I told him that perhaps we needed that time, that perhaps we needed to build trust and friendship before we could have this, that the love we had now was deeper for having been tested and proven genuine rather than assumed. Alexander considered this, then agreed. He said that he would not regret a single moment of our marriage, even the difficult early days, because all of it had led us here, to this moment, to this happiness. We talked until dawn began to lighten the sky, unwilling to sleep when being awake meant being together. We made promises and plans, discussed how we would navigate our relationship going forward now that pretense had been stripped away. We laughed at our own foolishness and marveled at the fortune that had brought us together despite every obstacle. As I finally drifted toward sleep, safe in Alexander's arms, I thought about the girl who had stood at an altar 2 months ago, abandoned and humiliated before hundreds of witnesses. She had thought her life was ending, that she would never recover from that shame. She had been so beautifully, wonderfully wrong, because that moment of humiliation had been the catalyst for everything good that followed. It had given me Alexander, had given me love, had given me a future, more wonderful than anything I had dared to dream. Lord Pemberton's cruelty had become the greatest gift he could have given me, and I would spend the rest of my life being grateful for it. 3 months had passed since that transformative evening in the library, and autumn had arrived in London with crisp mornings and leaves that turned the parks into tapestries of gold and crimson. The social season had ended. Most of society had retreated to their country estates, but Alexander and I had chosen to remain in town for a few more weeks before departing for his estate in Derbyshire. I had grown to love our life together, with an intensity that still surprised me. Every morning I woke in Alexander's arms, and every night I fell asleep listening to his heartbeat beneath my ear. The separate chambers that had once symbolized the distance between us now served as dressing rooms and private retreats. But we always ended our days together, in the same bed, tangled in sheets and each other. The transformation in our relationship had not gone unnoticed by society. The careful observers who made it their business to dissect every aristocratic marriage had noted the way Alexander looked at me, the way his hand lingered at my waist during dances, the way we leaned toward each other in conversation, as though drawn by invisible threads. What had begun as scandal had evolved into something that made the romantic-minded sigh and the cynical reconsider their assumptions about marriages of convenience. Lady Worthington had remarked, just last week over tea, that she had never seen two people more obviously besotted with each other, that we were positively indecent in our mutual affection, and she approved wholeheartedly. But the true test of how far we had come arrived in the form of an invitation to the Duchess of Hartwell's farewell ball, the last major event before the exodus to country estates became complete. The Duchess was society's reigning arbiter of taste and propriety. Her approval could make a reputation, her disapproval could destroy one, and she had invited us not merely as guests, but as the guests of honor. It was an unmistakable signal that our marriage, despite its scandalous origins, had achieved full acceptance in the highest echelons of society. Alexander told me about the invitation over breakfast, watching my face carefully for my reaction. He knew that such an honor would require us to be on display, to endure close scrutiny from every important family in London. He asked if I was comfortable with such attention, or if I would prefer to decline and escape to Derbyshire early. I told him I was not the same woman who had trembled at the thought of attending the Hendersons' ball, that I had proven myself over these months, had earned my place as Lady Ashford through my own efforts and character, and that I wanted to attend this ball with him, to show society that we were not merely scandal survivors, but a love match that had triumphed over extraordinary circumstances. Alexander smiled at that, the warm, genuine smile that he now showed freely, rather than hiding behind aristocratic reserve. He told me that he was proud of me, of the woman I had become, of the confidence I had built. Then he added, with a heat in his eyes that still made my breath catch, that he looked forward to dancing with me all evening and shocking the Duchess with how thoroughly he intended to monopolize his own wife's attention. The week before, the ball was filled with pleasant preparations. Madame Laurent arrived to ensure my gown was absolute perfection. Sarah fussed over my hair arrangements. And Alexander, in an unprecedented display of sentimentality, presented me with a new set of jewelry, diamonds and sapphires arranged in a design he had commissioned specifically for me. The necklace was extraordinary, but it was the meaning behind it that moved me to tears. Alexander told me that he wanted me to have something that was mine alone, not inherited from previous marchionesses, but created specifically for me, something that symbolized our love rather than his family's history. I kissed him thoroughly for that, and we very nearly missed dinner because neither of us was willing to stop touching the other long enough to dress properly. The evening of the Duchess's ball arrived with weather that seemed designed for romance, cool enough for velvet cloaks, clear enough for stars to be visible in the darkening sky. My gown was a masterpiece of midnight blue silk with silver embroidery that caught the light with every movement. Alexander's new jewelry sparkled at my throat and wrists, and Sarah had arranged my hair in an elaborate style that made me look regal and sophisticated. When Alexander saw me, he stopped in the doorway of my dressing room and simply stared. Then he told me, with gratifying sincerity, that I was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. and that every man at the ball would envy him for having won my heart. I reminded him that he had won my heart years ago. He had simply been too stubborn to claim it sooner. He laughed and pulled me into his arms for a kiss that threatened to ruin Sarah's careful work. The Duchess of Hartwell's ballroom was legendary, and it exceeded even the most elaborate descriptions I had heard. Crystal chandeliers descended from ceilings painted with classical frescoes. Mirrors lined the walls, multiplying the candlelight into infinite reflections. And flowers, thousands of roses in shades from pure white to deepest crimson, perfumed the air with their heavy sweetness. We were announced with full ceremony, and as we descended the grand staircase into the ballroom, I felt Alexander's hand tighten slightly on mine. Not from nervousness, he was far too composed for that, but from a kind of possessive pride that warmed me from the inside out. The Duchess herself greeted us, a formidable woman in her 60s, who ruled society with intelligence rather than mere title. She told me that she had been watching my progress with interest, that I had handled myself with remarkable grace under trying circumstances, and that she was pleased to see the Ashford marriage proving to be such a success. It was high praise from a woman known for her exacting standards, and I accepted it with gratitude. The evening unfolded like a dream. We danced together far more than propriety strictly allowed, but no one seemed inclined to criticize. Between dances, we circulated through the ballroom, greeting friends and acquaintances, comfortable in each other's presence in a way that required no performance or pretense. I saw Miss Arabella Thornton, Pemberton's sister, across the room at one point, and she approached with obvious hesitation. She told me that her brother had left London, that he was traveling on the continent, and had no plans to return for several years. She seemed relieved by this information, and I realized that his presence had been a burden to his family as well. I told her that I hoped he found whatever he was looking for, and that I bore her no ill will for his actions. She thanked me with tears in her eyes, and said that I was far kinder than her brother deserved. After she left, Alexander asked if I was troubled by the mention of Pemberton. I told him honestly that I felt nothing but pity for the man, that whatever revenge he had sought against my father had cost him far more than it had cost me, that his cruelty had given me everything while leaving him with nothing but exile and regret. Alexander kissed my hand and told me that my capacity for forgiveness was one of the many reasons he loved me. As the evening progressed, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 months ago, I had been standing in a church, abandoned and humiliated, believing my life was over. Now I stood in the most prestigious ballroom in London, married to the man I loved, accepted, and even celebrated by the society that had witnessed my downfall. It was during the supper interval that the most significant moment of the evening occurred. The Duchess had arranged for small tables in the adjoining dining room, and Alexander and I were seated with several other influential couples. The conversation was pleasant and wide-ranging, touching on politics, literature, and the usual society gossip. Then Lord Hartwell, the Duchess's eldest son and one of Alexander's closest friends, raised his glass and proposed a toast. He said that he wanted to celebrate not just the evening's festivities, but also the finest example of true love he had witnessed in all his years observing society's marriages. He spoke of how Alexander and I looked at each other, how we moved in unconscious harmony, how our marriage demonstrated that genuine affection and partnership were possible even in the highest echelons of society, where marriages were usually contracted for far less romantic reasons. The other guests at the table joined the toast, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks at such public acknowledgement. But Alexander simply raised his own glass, looked directly at me, and spoke. He told the assembled guests that Lord Hartwell was correct, that ours was indeed a love match, though it had taken an extraordinary path to reach that destination, that I had proven myself to be not just his wife, but his partner in every sense of the word, and that he counted the day I had placed my hand in his at St. George's Church as the most fortunate day of his life. There was something in his tone, a depth of sincerity that transcended mere social performance, that made several of the ladies sigh audibly. And when Alexander leaned across the small space between us and kissed me, properly kissed me in full view of everyone present, there were actual gasps of delighted scandal. The Duchess herself, when we returned to the ballroom after supper, told me with a knowing smile that we were setting a dangerous precedent, that other wives would now expect similar affection from their husbands, and we would be blamed for raising impossible standards. I told her that I thought higher standards might be precisely what society needed. She laughed outright at that and declared that she liked me immensely. As the ball wound toward its conclusion, Alexander and I shared one final dance. The waltz was slower than the earlier dances, more intimate, and Alexander held me as close as propriety allowed, and perhaps slightly closer than that. He told me, as we moved through the steps, that he had something important to discuss with me. My heart skipped slightly at his serious tone, but he quickly smiled to reassure me. He said that he had been thinking about our future, about what we wanted from our life together, beyond the social obligations and expectations of our positions. He asked me what I wanted, truly wanted, now that we had the freedom and resources to pursue anything we desired. I was touched that he would ask, that he cared about my aspirations beyond being Lady Ashford. I told him that I wanted to make a difference, to use our position and wealth to help others in the way he had helped the Hendricks family, that I wanted to establish schools for children of tenant farmers, to create charitable organizations that actually addressed real needs, rather than merely making society matrons feel virtuous. Alexander's eyes lit up at this, and he told me that he had hoped I would say something like that. That he had been planning similar initiatives, but had been waiting to discuss them with me, wanting to ensure we approached such work as true partners. That he valued my intelligence and insight too much to make such decisions without my input. We spent the rest of the dance discussing possibilities, our voices low and our heads close together, oblivious to the other dancers and the watching crowd. We talked about education and agriculture, about tenant rights and fair labor practices, about all the ways we might use our privilege to create positive change. It was, in its way, as romantic as any declaration of love, because it showed that Alexander saw me not just as a wife to be cherished, but as an equal partner whose thoughts and ambitions mattered as much as his own. When the ball finally ended and we returned home in the early hours of morning, I felt a contentment so profound it was almost overwhelming. We had proven to society and to ourselves that what had begun in scandal had transformed into something beautiful and true. As we prepared for bed, together now, in the chambers we shared, Alexander pulled me into his arms and told me that he had one more confession to make. I looked up at him with curiosity, wondering what he could possibly need to confess after everything we had already shared. He told me that when he had walked into St. George's Church that morning 6 months ago, he had been terrified, not of the scandal or the social consequences, but of the possibility that I might refuse his offer, that I might prefer humiliation to marriage with him, that he might have finally worked up the courage to claim me only to discover I didn't want to be claimed. I told him that was the most absurd fear imaginable, that any woman would have been mad to refuse him, but especially me, who had loved him for years. He smiled at that, but continued. He said that he had stood at that altar, hand extended, and in the few seconds before I placed my hand in his, he had made a vow to himself. If I accepted, he would spend the rest of his life proving himself worthy of the trust I was placing in him. He would be the husband I deserved, the partner I needed, the man who could make me happy despite the terrible circumstances that had brought us together. I told him, with tears in my eyes, that he had more than fulfilled that vow, that he had given me everything I had never dared to hope for, that the girl who had been abandoned at the altar had been lost and broken, but the woman who had been rescued by a marquess had found herself and her purpose, and a love that transcended every difficulty. We made love that night with a tenderness and passion that felt like yet another vow, unspoken, but deeply felt. And as I drifted toward sleep in Alexander's arms, I thought about the extraordinary path that had brought me here. I had been engaged to a coward who had planned to humiliate me as revenge for my father's sins. Instead, I had been rescued by a man who had loved me silently for years, who had given me not just his name and protection, but his heart and his trust and his partnership. The scandal of my wedding day would be remembered in London society for years to come. People would tell the story at dinner parties, would speculate about the drama and romance of it all, would add embellishments and fictional details until the truth was buried beneath layers of gossip. But I knew the truth. I had lived it. And the truth was simpler and more profound than any story society could construct. I had been loved. I was loved. I would be loved for all the years to come. And that love had been worth every moment of humiliation, every instant of uncertainty, every trial we had endured, because true love, the kind that saw you clearly and chose you anyway, that respected your intelligence and valued your strength, that made you a partner rather than a possession, was worth any price. 6 months ago, I had thought my life was ending. Instead, it had been beginning. And as I fell asleep beside my husband, my hand in his and our hearts beating in tandem, I knew with absolute certainty that this was exactly where I was meant to be, not because fate had decreed it, but because two people had chosen each other, had fought for each other, had built something beautiful from the ruins of scandal and humiliation. My fiancé had left me at the altar, but the Marquess had taken my hand before the crowd, and in doing so, he had given me the world.